The pot roast was still steaming when my mother set her fork down mid-bite, tines resting against the good china she only brought out for Sunday dinners. My name is Renata Akavarvas. Everyone calls me Ren. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent 19 years as a claims adjudicator for a private disability insurance carrier, trained to separate what a person says happened from what the paperwork actually shows. My mother looked at me across the table, the way she does when she's about to say something she's decided is honesty rather than cruelty. "Let's be honest," she said. "You married a rich widower. You're just a gold digger. I want you to understand something before I tell you how we got to that sentence." By the time I got home that night, the email was already sent. And by that Friday, my mother would need a new guarantor for her apartment lease. One she didn't have. I didn't argue with her at the table. I've spent 19 years learning that arguing with someone's version of events rarely changes the record, it just delays it. So I thanked her for dinner, the way I always do, and I reached for my coat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct her in front of anyone. I just gathered my things, kissed her cheek the way I always did, and walked out to my car in the same quiet way I'd walked out of that apartment building 100 times before. I want to tell you about the 6 years I spent being the reason my mother never had to worry about rent. And the one dinner it took for her to forget that entirely. Welcome back to Calm Destruction Stories. This one's for anyone who's ever quietly financed a parent's independence and gotten an accusation back instead of a thank you, anyone who's been recast as the villain in a story where they were actually the safety net the whole time. If that's you, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if my mother's line at that table sounded like a voice from your own family, tell me that too. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, long before Desmond, long before that dinner, long before any of this needed proving. For 19 years, I've reviewed disability claims for a private insurance carrier, which means my job is to sit with a file after a physician has signed it, a claimant has submitted it, and a first-level reviewer has already approved it, and ask the one question nobody else in the chain once asked. Does this actually hold together under its own weight? I read medical documentation for a living. I read correspondence, payment histories, diagnosis codes, and I check whether what's written matches what's true. Years ago, I was handed a file that had already passed through 3 reviewers ahead of me. A physician's letter described the claimant's condition using terminology that simply didn't align with the diagnosis code stamped on the same page, a mismatch specific enough that anyone trained to look for it should have caught it on the first read. Nobody had. I flagged it, wrote up the discrepancy in 2 sentences, and sent it back down the chain without comment. People sometimes mistake my temperament for passivity, the way I don't argue in the moment when something is wrong in front of me. It isn't passivity. It's trust, earned over 19 years, that a record will eventually show exactly what it needs to show, whether or not I raise my voice about it today. At home, growing up, my older brother Theo was always the one my mother worried about, the one whose choices needed managing, whose moods needed reading before dinner even started. I was always the one who just handled it. If a bill came due, if a form needed signing, if someone needed to sit on hold with a utility company for 40 minutes, that was mine. Nobody assigned it to me formally. It simply became understood, the way certain things in families become understood without anyone ever agreeing to them out loud. That habit of handling it, quietly, without needing thanks for it, is exactly what led me, 6 years ago, to put my own name on a lease that was never mine to begin with. The year my father died, my mother said one thing over and over to anyone who called to check on her. "I can manage fine alone." She said it at the funeral luncheon. She said it to her sister on the phone. She said it to me, standing in the kitchen with a casserole dish someone had dropped off, still warm. What she didn't say was that she'd already missed 2 mortgage payments by the time she said it the 3rd time. I found out by accident, going through a folder of paperwork she'd asked me to help her organize, back before I understood that help organize in my family always meant quietly fix the house sold within the year, not because she chose to sell it, but because the gap between what she could manage and what she said she could manage had gotten too wide to keep hiding. Nobody sat me down and asked me to close that gap. It simply landed on me, the way certain things in a family land on the person everyone's already decided is good with numbers. I wasn't married yet. I didn't have children pulling at my schedule the way Theo's 2 kids pulled at his. I was, by the family's quiet math, the one with room. If I had to put a name to what was actually happening, I'd call it being handed the bill nobody wanted to see. I was the one who quietly closed whatever financial gap my mother wouldn't admit to out loud, term after term, year after year, while Theo was never once asked to put in $1. Nobody framed it as unfair. It simply wasn't discussed, the same way you don't discuss which chair is whose at a table you sat at for 30 years. My mother has always been a proud woman, proud in the specific way that matters most in front of her church friends, the ones who compliment her outfits and ask after her health, and have no idea what her actual bank balance looks like on the 15th of any given month. She has never, not once, described what I do for her as help. And her telling, it was simply what a daughter does. Owed, not given. I don't think she ever sat down and decided that consciously. I think it settled into her the way water settles into whatever shape is offered to it. I told myself, for a long time, that if I kept the numbers quiet, I was protecting her dignity. That letting her tell her church friends she managed fine alone was a kindness, not a lie I was helping her keep alive. For 6 years, I believed that keeping her secret and protecting her were the same thing. That belief held right up until the dinner where she decided my own character was something worth discussing over pot roast, in front of people who mattered to me. At Theo's birthday dinner that year, my mother's cousins had driven up from 2 towns over, the ones who only appear at milestone gatherings and always bring a bottle of wine nicer than anyone expects. I was refilling water glasses when I heard my mother's voice carry from the living room, warm and confiding, the tone she uses when she thinks she's paying someone a compliment. Renata finally landed on her feet, she said, to cousins Marguerite and Alma, who nodded along politely. Married a widower, an architect, 12 years older. Good for her, honestly. I didn't say anything. I stood in the doorway with the water pitcher still in my hand, and I noted, the way I note things in a file, the exact date and the 2 names in that room, who just heard my marriage described as a landing rather than a choice. I didn't correct her. I didn't set the pitcher down harder than I needed to. I just finished refilling glasses and carried the conversation forward the way you carry any conversation you've decided isn't worth having in front of company. Later that week, I did what I'd done every year since my father died. I sat down with my banking app and adjusted the automatic transfer I'd set up for my mother's rent shortfall, the gap between what her fixed income covered and what the building actually charged. I increased it slightly that month, the way I usually did each fall when her utility costs crept up. I didn't mention what I'd overheard at Theo's dinner. I didn't call her to ask why she'd described my marriage that way to 2 women I saw twice a year. I just made the transfer, on time, the way I always did. I want you to sit with that contrast for a second, because I did. In the same week my mother told her cousins I'd landed on my feet through Desmond's money, I was quietly increasing the amount of my own money going toward keeping her afloat. She was rewriting the story of who rescued whom, and I was still the one paying for the actual rescue, the one nobody in that living room knew was happening at all. I didn't say anything to her about it. Not that week, not the next. I paid the shortfall the way I always paid it, on the first of the month, without comment, and I told myself the silence cost me nothing. It did, though. It just wasn't a cost I let myself count yet. The renewal came up that spring, the way it did every 3 years, and my mother mentioned it to me over the phone the same way she'd mentioned needing a light bulb changed. The building manager wanted someone more stable listed on the addendum, she said, given her age now, and would I mind signing again? I told her of course, the way I always told her of course, and I drove over that Saturday with a pen already in my bag, the same guarantor agreement I'd renewed without a second thought since the year my father died. I signed it at her kitchen table. She thanked me the way you thank someone for passing the salt. Around that same time, I ran into her friend Cheryl at the pharmacy, the 2 of us waiting on prescriptions, and Cheryl mentioned, warmly, how lucky my mother was these days. She told me Desmond practically bought her that apartment, Cheryl said, smiling like she was sharing good news. I smiled back and said something forgettable, and I stood there afterward turning the sentence over in my head because I couldn't find a single dollar of Desmond's anywhere near that lease. Not one payment. Not one conversation between the 2 of them about it. I would have known. I'm the one who reads every line of that file. I want to ask you something, if you don't mind me pausing here. If you've ever quietly kept someone afloat while they told other people a completely different story about how they got there, tell me in the comments how long you let that version stand before it started to actually bother you. For me, it had been years already, and I still hadn't said a word. I didn't correct Cheryl. I didn't call my mother and ask why Desmond's name kept attaching itself to a story he had no part in. I filed it away instead, mentally, next to the cousins at Theo's birthday and the shortfall I'd been quietly covering for 6 years, and I told myself I was simply gathering the full picture before I decided anything needed to be said at all. That's the thing about my job that spills over into the rest of my life, whether I want it to or not. I don't act on a single inconsistency. I wait to see whether it's a pattern, because a pattern is the only thing that actually tells you the truth of a file. So I decided, standing in that pharmacy with my prescription bag in hand, to simply keep watching. The same way I've watched 100 claims quietly reveal themselves over time, if you give them enough rope and enough patience to do it. Watching quietly is the whole of what I do for a living. And the next thing I noticed cost me far more than any false story about an apartment ever could. The pot roast was still steaming when my mother set her fork down mid-bite, tines resting against the good china she only brought out for Sunday dinners. Priya had come with Desmond that week, home from her second year of college, sitting across from my mother, with the easy politeness of someone who still assumed every adult at the table basically liked each other. "Let's be honest," my mother said, looking at me, not at anyone else. "You married a rich widower. You're just a gold digger." Priya's face went still, the specific stillness of someone recalculating an adult they thought they understood. Desmond set his fork down without finishing his bite, and I watched him do it, because in 4 years of marriage, I had never once seen him publicly stung on my behalf. He'd absorbed plenty from his own family's opinions over the years. He'd never had to absorb it from mine, not out loud, not at a table with his daughter sitting 3 feet away. This wasn't a comment to cousins in another room. This was said directly, over pot roast, in front of the 2 people whose opinion of me mattered more than almost anyone else's. I didn't defend myself at the table. I thanked my mother for dinner the way I always did, and I drove home in a silence that had nothing performative in it at all. That night, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while I was still hanging up my coat. It was Marisol, my downstairs neighbor, a paralegal who'd lived below me for 11 years and had watched me carry folders back and forth from my mother's building more times than either of us had ever counted out loud. She hadn't been at dinner. She didn't need to be. "You've never told me what you actually pay for her," the text said. "Do you want to?" I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at that message for a long time before I answered it. I wasn't angry yet. I want to be honest about that, because I think anger would have been the easier feeling to sit with. What I actually felt was quieter and colder than anger, the same feeling I get at my desk when a file stops making sense, and I understand, all at once, that it was never going to make sense, because it was never supposed to. I was doing what I always do when something doesn't add up. I was starting to look at the actual numbers. I opened my laptop. I didn't call my mother. I didn't text Desmond to check on him, though I would later, once I'd had a chance to sit with my own reaction first. I created a new folder on my desktop, empty, waiting, and I gave it a name that didn't need to be clever, because no one else would ever think to look for it. I named it, simply, Lease. That folder didn't stay small for long. Once I start reviewing a record properly, I've never once found it stopped at just the first page. I started with my own bank statements, 6 years of them, pulling every transfer I'd made toward my mother's rent shortfall, and lining them up against the building management company's notices, month by month, the way I'd line up a claimant's payment history against a provider's billing record. The total surprised me, and I don't surprise easily. I had covered gaps amounting to far more than I'd ever let myself tally in my head, spread across 72 months of automatic transfers I'd adjusted upward nearly every fall, without one sitting down to add the whole picture together. I called the building's management office next and requested a copy of the current lease addendum, which I was entitled to as guarantor of record, a phrase that still felt strange to say out loud about my own mother's apartment. The document arrived by email 2 days later, and I read it the way I read everything, slowly, once for what it said, and once for what it assumed I already understood. Buried in the 3rd page was a clause I'd signed 6 years ago, and genuinely forgotten was there. Guarantor consent was required for any lease renewal. Not preferred. Required. Which meant the entire tenancy, every 3-year term since my father died, had depended on my signature specifically, not on my mother's independence, not on her ability to manage fine alone, a phrase I'd heard her use at his funeral luncheon and 100 times since. I cross-referenced the dates on that addendum against the timeline of what I'd overheard at Theo's birthday, against what Cheryl had told me at the pharmacy about Desmond practically buying the apartment. I searched the financial history attached to the lease file for any trace of his name, any payment, any correspondence, anything at all connecting him to that address. There was nothing. Not $1. Not one signature. His name didn't appear anywhere in 6 years of paperwork because he had never once been part of it. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen table, the folder named lease no longer small at all, and I understood something with a clarity I hadn't let myself reach before. My mother's entire housing stability, every renewal, every quiet crisis avoided, had rested on my signature the whole time. Not on her own management. Not on Desmond's money. Mine, specifically, term after term, a fact she had let everyone around her forget, including, I suspected, herself. Knowing what I'd been carrying was one thing. Knowing exactly how to set it down without being cruel about it was going to be the harder part. I called Marisol the next evening, and this time I brought her the folder instead of just the text message. She read the addendum twice, the same slow, careful way she reads any contract, and when she looked up she said it plainly, the way paralegals say things when they've stopped softening the truth for anyone's comfort. As sole guarantor, I had full legal standing to withdraw my name from the lease at any renewal point. It wasn't a scheme, she said. It wasn't a punishment either. It was simply declining to keep signing for someone who had spent years publicly insisting she didn't need my signature at all. I gathered everything into one folder that week. 6 years of bank statements. The original guarantor agreement from the year my father died. The current addendum with its clause about consent I'd forgotten and now couldn't stop reading. I decided against confronting my mother at the next family gathering, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I'd learned, 19 years into my career, that the cleanest way to close a file isn't always to argue about what's in it. Sometimes it's simply to stop signing. The next renewal deadline fell 3 weeks after Theo's birthday dinner. I marked the date and decided that was where this would end, quietly, on schedule, without a single raised voice at any table. In those same 3 weeks, my mother kept talking. She told a woman from her church group that Desmond had set her up nicely for her later years. She told Cheryl again, a slightly bigger version this time, that she barely worried about money anymore, not since Renata married so well. Each version grew a little more confident, a little more detailed, and I noticed that confidence has a way of expanding to fill whatever room silence leaves for it. She had no idea the version of her life she was describing so comfortably already had an expiration date filed with a building management office 3 miles from her apartment. I want you to sit with that contrast the way I did, because it followed me around for those 3 weeks. She was growing more certain by the day. I was growing more clear. Certainty and clarity aren't the same thing, and only one of us in that story was actually looking at the paperwork. The night of that pot roast dinner, the same night she called me a gold digger across her own table, I drove home, hung up my coat, and sat down at my kitchen table with the folder open beside my laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone to vent. I opened an email to the property management office, attached the necessary documentation, and wrote, in plain, unremarkable language, that I would not be co-signing the upcoming lease renewal. I read it once, the way I read every document before I let it leave my hands. Then I sent it. With that email gone, all that was left now was for the consequence to arrive exactly where my mother's certainty lived. In writing. From someone else entirely. The same table, the same china, the pot roast replaced this time by a roasted chicken, since Theo's birthday lunch had been pushed back a week. Desmond and Priya sat in the same chairs as before. Theo's wife, Camille, was setting out napkins when I walked in, and my mother was already fussing over the serving dishes in the kitchen, cheerful in a way that had settled fully back into place since the week before. I noticed the envelope before I noticed anything else in that kitchen. It sat unopened on the counter near the toaster, the building management company's logo printed in the corner, and I recognized it instantly because I'd been copied on the confirmation email 4 days earlier, confirming it had been mailed. My mother hadn't opened it yet. She'd set it there the way you set aside something you've already decided isn't urgent. The usual paperwork, she said lightly, catching me looking at it as she carried the chicken to the table. I'll deal with it this week. It always sorts itself out. She said it the way she says most things about her finances, breezy, certain, the tone of a woman who has never once had a reason to doubt that things simply arrange themselves in her favor. She had no idea that this particular piece of paperwork had already sorted itself in the opposite direction, 3 weeks earlier, in an email she hadn't been copied on at all. I want to ask you something, if you let me. If you've ever watched someone confidently plan around a safety net you'd already quietly removed, you know that watching isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's just waiting for the truth to arrive on its own schedule, instead of forcing it out of your own mouth at a dinner table. Tell me if you've ever had to let something play out like that, instead of saying it yourself. We ate. Theo told a story about his kid's soccer season. Priya laughed at something Desmond said under his breath. My mother refilled water glasses and mentioned, once more, how relieved she always felt once the lease renewal was behind her for another 3 years. After the plates were cleared, she finally reached for the envelope, tearing it open with the same unhurried confidence she'd carried through the whole meal, glancing at it the way you glance at something you expect to be routine. My mother unfolded the letter and read it aloud, the way she does with anything official, her voice moving from cheerful to confused within the space of 2 sentences. She read that the property management office required a new guarantor by Friday, since the current guarantor of record had formally declined to co-sign the upcoming renewal. She looked up from the page, genuinely bewildered, the confusion on her face entirely unperformed. Who would have done this? She asked, glancing around the table as though the answer might be sitting in someone else's chair. I set down my water glass. I did, I said, evenly, the same tone I use when I'm closing out a file that's already taken far longer than it should have. I've been the guarantor on this lease for 6 years, Mom. Every shortfall, every renewal, every time the numbers didn't work, that went through my signature. Not Desmond's. Not anyone's rescue but mine. I'm not doing that anymore for someone who called me a gold digger at the same table. I reached into my bag and set 2 things on the tablecloth, beside the good china, not waving them, just placing them the way you'd set down something you needed someone to actually read, rather than simply witness. The original guarantor agreement, 6 years old, my signature at the bottom in the same handwriting I still use. And beneath it, a printed record of 6 years of my own shortfall payments, dated and totaled, the numbers plain enough that no one at that table needed a claims adjudicator to understand what they meant. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room began to react in pieces, the way rooms do once something true has finally been set down in front of them, instead of talked around. Camille went very still over her plate, her fork resting where she'd left it mid-bite, her eyes moving from the papers to my mother and back again. Priya glanced quickly at Desmond, a fast, searching look, as though she were checking whether he already knew, and something in his steady expression told her he did. My mother's mouth opened. I watched her reach for something to say, the reflex of a woman who has never once, in my whole life, been without an answer at that table. Nothing arrived. She looked down at the papers instead of at me, her fingers hovering over the printed totals without actually touching them, as though touching them would make the numbers more real than they already were. I didn't fill the silence for her. I've spent 19 years learning that the truest test of whether a claim holds up is what happens when you stop explaining it and simply let it sit there, in writing, for someone to read on their own. I let the paper sit. I let the letter sit, half refolded in her hand. I let the quiet stretch out across a table that had, 3 weeks earlier and every 3 years before that, depended entirely on a signature nobody at that table had ever once thanked me for. Theo shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, his eyes moving over the guarantor agreement the way you look at a document you're seeing clearly for the first time. I could see him doing the arithmetic in real time, the same arithmetic I'd done alone at my kitchen table weeks earlier, 6 years compressed into a single column of numbers he'd never been shown. My mother finally spoke, her voice thinner than it had been reading the letter aloud. Renata, she didn't finish it. Whatever she'd meant to say caught somewhere before it reached her mouth, and she set the letter down on the table next to the papers I'd already placed there, as though putting distance between herself and the words wouldn't change what they said. A silence like that one doesn't stay silent for long. Not with everyone who mattered to her version of herself sitting right there at that table, watching the paperwork say what I had never needed to say myself. My mother's composure broke first as disbelief, her eyes moving between the papers on the table and my face, as though hoping one of us would turn out to be a misunderstanding. Then she reached for something steadier. I never said you weren't generous, Renata, she said. Don't twist my words. Her voice thinned on the word generous, the syllables losing their footing halfway through. Her hand trembled, setting the letter back down on the tablecloth, the paper rasping softly against the linen, and I noticed she set it down twice, as though the first attempt hadn't quite landed where she meant it to. Theo hadn't said anything yet. I watched him reach across the table and slide the printed shortfall statements a few inches closer to himself, turning them so he could actually read the columns rather than glance at them from across the table. It was the first time in 6 years I'd seen him look closely at anything I'd carried for her. His jaw tightened somewhere around the second page, the way a person's face changes when arithmetic stops being abstract and starts being personal. Desmond didn't say a word either. He reached over and rested his hand briefly on top of mine on the table, not gripping, just steady, there, the way you'd anchor something that didn't need anchoring, but deserved it anyway. It registered more than anything he could have said out loud. Priya had been watching my mother closely since the letter first came out, quieter than I'd ever seen her at that table. "Grandma," she said, her voice careful but unflinching, "did you actually think Ren couldn't hear you?" My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out of it. She looked at her granddaughter the way you look at someone who has just asked the one question you genuinely have no answer prepared for, and the silence that followed told the whole table more than any response could have. I didn't say anything else. I'd already said what needed saying, plainly, once, and I've never believed in repeating a true thing, simply because the room hasn't fully absorbed it yet. I sat with my hands folded on the edge of the table, the same posture I hold through any difficult meeting, and I let my mother sit with what Theo was reading, what Priya had asked, what Desmond's hand on mine had already answered without a single word. Camille quietly stood and started gathering plates, the chicken barely touched on most of them, moving around the table with the particular efficiency of someone who needs something to do with her hands. Nobody stopped her. Nobody resumed the conversation about soccer season or the weather or anything at all. My mother stayed seated, staring at the guarantor agreement without picking it back up, her fingers pressed flat against the tablecloth, as though she were trying to keep the whole table from tilting. I watched her search the room once, quickly, for someone who might come to her defense the way rooms had always come to her defense before. Nobody did. Theo kept his eyes on the papers. Priya kept her eyes on her grandmother, waiting. Desmond's hand stayed exactly where it was. The lunch dissolved from there, quietly, the way things end when nobody has the appetite to pretend otherwise. Camille cleared plates no one was eating from anymore, and the afternoon closed itself down around a table that had, 3 weeks earlier, already decided how this particular story was going to end. By Friday, my mother had no new guarantor lined up. The building management office extended a short grace period, but only after Theo called them himself, something I hadn't expected and hadn't asked for. He stepped in that week, splitting the shortfall coverage going forward, instead of leaving it entirely to me the way it had been for 6 years. He didn't make a speech about it. He just told me, quietly, over the phone, that he'd be handling half from now on, and that he wished I'd said something sooner. My mother's version of events, the one she'd told Cheryl and her church friends and anyone else who'd listen, quietly stopped circulating after that lunch. Several of the people who'd heard it over the years had also, directly or indirectly, heard the truth by then, and stories like hers don't survive long once the people who repeated them have seen the paperwork for themselves. I didn't cut her off. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be easy to assume that's how a story like this ends. I still call her. I still show up for Sunday dinners, though the pot roast tastes different to me now in a way I can't fully explain. What changed is simpler than a severance. I stopped being the only name on any document tied to her life. That's a boundary, not an ending. Marisol checked in a few weeks later, sitting on my porch steps the way she has for 11 years, and she told me she was glad I'd finally said the number out loud, glad I'd let someone else read the file instead of carrying it silently the way I always had. We didn't make anything more of it than that. We're the same steady, unshowy friends we've always been, and I think that's exactly what a friendship like ours was built to survive. My mother called me one evening, about a month after that lunch, her voice different than I'd ever heard it on the phone. She said she may have spoken too quickly at that dinner. It wasn't an apology, not really, not the kind with my name attached to any real acknowledgement of what 6 years had actually cost me. But it was the closest thing I had ever heard come out of her mouth in that direction, and I decided to accept it for exactly what it was. No more than that. No less, either. I didn't ask her to say more. I've spent 19 years learning that some records simply close the way they close, imperfectly, without a final clean line drawn under them, and that insisting on a better ending than the one actually offered rarely gets you anywhere closer to the truth. Months later, with the paperwork finally shared instead of solely mine, I found myself standing somewhere quieter than victory. Not triumphant. Not vindicated in the way I might have imagined at that dinner table. Just steady, in a way I hadn't been in longer than I wanted to admit. I've had time to sit with what I actually learned from that dinner, and it comes down to something simpler than I expected. Protecting my mother's dignity and protecting her from consequence were never the same thing. For 6 years I let the first stand in for the second because it felt kinder, when really it had just been easier for everyone at that table but me. I think about that difference now on quiet evenings, sitting at my own kitchen table with Desmond, the two of us going through our shared household budget together, line by line. Every signature on that budget is a choice we make together, not an obligation one of us absorbs, so the other never has to think about it. It's a small thing to notice, a spreadsheet and 2 cups of coffee going cold, but it's the thing I hold on to now when I think about what changed. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's that being generous was never the same as being invisible. You can hand someone the world quietly for years and still deserve to be seen clearly for what you gave. A boundary held calmly is still a boundary, even when nobody claps for it, even when the person on the other side calls it something uglier than what it actually was. If this reminded you of a story your own family tells about you, one that isn't quite true, one you've let stand because correcting it felt like more trouble than it was worth, tell me about it in the comments. And if you've ever had to quietly correct the record yourself, go ahead and subscribe, because these stories, every one of them, are for you.